They say that in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But that isn't entirely true. In the far future, there are also the unimaginably wealthy, us, the high-born elite of the Imperium of Man. We live far above the billions of common souls, in palaces that scrape the bottom of the heavens, surrounded by treasures and luxuries beyond the dreams of ancient kings. Yes, I am one of the richest men alive in the 41st millennium, and this is my story. I invite you to look beyond the gilded doors and crystalline spires and see the truth of my life, our lives. Among the highborn, it is a truth drenched in darkness and decadence. If you think being rich in this galaxy means safety or happiness, you are mistaken. It means power, certainly. It means indulgence, without a doubt. But it also means living every day perched on the edge of a knife, balanced above an abyss of intrigue, danger, and horror. In the Imperium, wealth is not a cushion. It is a target painted on your back and a poison seeping into your soul. My name is Septimus Rorim. Perhaps you've heard of House Rorim. On my world of Maltheria Prime, it's a name spoken with a mix of reverence and dread. We have ruled this planet for 8 generations. Maltheria Prime is a prosperous hive world, its population so vast the Administratum long ago stopped trying to count. Our hive cities reach for the sky, and at the pinnacle of the tallest spire of the capital, Hive sits the Rorim Palace, my home. From that height, when I look down, I cannot even see the city's lowest levels through the toxic haze. They lie shrouded in perpetual smog and darkness. In daylight, one can barely discern the other distant hive spires on the horizon, poking through the poisonous haze like gravestones on a dead planet. The ground beyond the city is nothing but ash dunes and chemical sludge ponds left by millennia of unbridled industry. Down there, in the depths, billions toil and suffer, living and dying without ever glimpsing the sun. Up here, we bask in artificial daylight under vaulted domes of crystal, feasting while the masses starve. I was born into this world of extreme privilege and extreme peril. From the moment of my birth, my life was never truly my own. It belonged to my house, to duty, to legacy. I took my first breaths in a grand chamber, decorated with golden frescoes of the God Emperor's victories. 100 generations of my ancestors stared down at me from oil portraits. My mother, Lady Celeste, had succumbed to a fever when I was just an infant. An all-too-common tragedy, even for nobility in the 41st millennium, proving that even our wealth could not always defy mortality. In her absence, it was a trusted nurse who took charge of my early care, and on the night I was born, she placed me into a cradle carved from rare orchidea wood imported from a distant pleasure world. It was a scene of sublime wealth and beauty, fit for an heir of Maltheria Prime. And yet even on that first night, an assassin nearly ended my life before it had truly begun. They caught the intruder, a menial worker from the mid-hive, bribed by one of our rival houses to slip poison into my milk. I, of course, remember none of this. I was an infant. But the lesson was impressed upon me as soon as I was old enough to understand. Every breath I take is a gift that someone out there would snatch from me. That was my baptism into the reality of being highborn. Most children get lullabies. I got poison warnings. From as early as I can recall, my education was as lethal as it was enlightening. My tutors taught me letters and logic, yes, but also the fine art of detecting lies behind a courtier's honeyed smile. I learned history and mathematics while also learning how to spot the shimmer of a hidden needle-tip power blade at a dinner party. I practiced painting and piano by day and studied the anatomy of the human body by night, specifically where to slip a stiletto between the ribs for a quick kill or how a subtle drop of toxin can mimic a natural illness. By the age of 12, I could recite the litany of the saints and silently kill a man in the dark with my bare hands. These were the twin faces of my upbringing, one refined and cultured, one cold and ruthless. I did have a childhood of sorts, but it was nothing like the carefree play of common children. My games were carefully staged tests of cunning and nerve. Imagine a masquerade ball for juveniles, masks and all, where each of us young heirs was assigned secret objectives. Steal a key from one noble scion, plant a fake love letter on another, publicly embarrass a third with a well-timed prank, all while our parents watched from the balconies above, scoring our performance. That was one of the milder exercises. Another memory. At 13, I woke to find my bedroom door unlocked and unguarded, a rare occurrence, and a cryptic note daring me to venture into the palace's forgotten subcellars to find a great prize. It was a test, of course. Down I went into the dust and darkness, armed only with a pilfered letter opener. In the bowels of the palace, I encountered a pair of servitors that had been programmed with crude combat protocols and left to roam, lobotomized human machines with rusted claws. They attacked on sight, relentless. It was them or me. I still bear a scar on my shoulder from that night, but I prevailed, barely. And the prize I found in the last chamber was my father, Lord Antonidas Rorim, seated calmly with a glass of amasec. "Now you understand," he said as I, panting and bloodied, stood before him. "Never trust anyone completely, not even your own blood, and never hesitate. Hesitation is death at our height. Those were my lessons. Love was a weapon to be wielded or a weakness to excise. Kindness was an alien concept, dangerous if given, exploitable if received. To this day, I am not certain I ever felt a genuine innocent friendship in my youth. How could I? Every other child of the nobility was both a comrade and a potential rival. We smiled and danced together under crystal chandeliers, but each of us knew that if fortune's wheel turned, we might one day have to put a dagger in each other's backs, or hire someone to do it for us. Thus I learned to wear a mask before I learned to shave. By 16, I was the dutiful heir in public, impeccably mannered, pious in reciting the required prayers to the emperor, gracious to our house's allies, and icily polite to our enemies. But beneath that veneer, I was already something of a cynic. How could I not be? I saw the hypocrisy of it all, even as a teenager. I would stand in the grand cathedral of High Viterna next to Father during holy festivals, both of us draped in solemn robes, as the cardinal intoned prayers for the prosperity of Maltheria Prime and the guidance of the god emperor. Meanwhile, I knew that the same cardinal had a standing invitation to our feasting table and had personally enjoyed the favors of at least two of our house's courtesans on pious retreats. My father ensured the ecclesiarchy's local leaders were well taken care of through generous donations and other, more carnal gifts, so that the church would, in turn, support our rule among the populace. The faith of the masses was just another currency to be leveraged. This is the sort of lesson a high-born child internalizes early. Everyone and everything has a price, and proclaimed virtue is often just another mask. I learned to measure people by their desires and fears. Find what a person lusts after or dreads, and you hold their leash. Some lessons were taught explicitly, others I inferred by observing the adults around me. The nobility of Maltheria Prime loved to talk about honor, tradition, service. But in private I saw what really moved them. Greed, vanity, envy, and sometimes far baser appetites. I witnessed an esteemed lady of a noble house who publicly decried adultery pay a fortune to hide the existence of her own bastard son. born of a tryst with an off-world trader. I watched my uncle smile and toast a council rival at a winter ball, only to order that same rival's air car shot down on his flight home. When I naively pointed out the contradiction to my tutor, he gave a thin smile and said, "Such is the way of the high-born, young lord. We are nothing if not elegantly two-faced. My family, House Rorim, was neither the largest nor the oldest noble house on Maltheria Prime, but through calculated marriage alliances and sheer mercantile acumen, we had become unquestionably the richest. Our influence stretched beyond this world. We had kin by marriage on other planets and lucrative trade links across the sector, ensuring the name of House Rorim was known and respected or feared in many courts. Our wealth came primarily from controlling the planet's adamantium mines and a majority stake in the great manufactorum complexes of Hive Eterna. If you've ever held a las gun stamped with the Aquila and a small Gothic R beneath it, that weapon likely came from one of our factories. War feeds the Imperium, and we quietly grew fat supplying the materials of war. By the time I came of age, our family fortune had more zeros than I could count, and yet it never felt like enough. There is a peculiar thing about immense wealth. It begets an immense fear of losing it. Perhaps that is why my father was so relentless in teaching me ruthlessness. He had clawed our house up from merely well-off to dominantly wealthy in his lifetime, and he was determined that nothing and no one would jeopardize that legacy. Not Xenos raiders, not market fluctuations, and certainly not an inadequate heir. If I had failed any of his tests, I suspect I would not be sitting here telling you this story. I'd have had a convenient accident, and one of my more promising cousins would be monologuing in my place. Father never said as much, but I sensed it in his gaze during our training duels. A cold disappointment whenever I showed a hint of mercy or hesitation, a slight nod of approval only when I struck decisively and without remorse. So I learned. I became what he wanted, a creature of ambition tempered by caution, charming in society, but utterly calculating beneath the surface. I excelled in my formal studies of economics and politics, subjects as lethal as any blade work. I learned how a slight change in grain tariffs could incite food riots in the lower hive, or how a well-placed bribe to an administratum official might reduce our tithe grade and save us millions of throne gelt. Information became another weapon in my arsenal. I devoured archives of other houses' dealings, looking for advantages. By 18, I could recite the lineage and scandal of every noble family in our subsector. Who was in debt, who hated whom, who had secretly corresponded with a rogue trader, or, throne forbid, a heretic. The data slates and parchment stacks of the library were as much my sparring partners as any fencing instructor. In all these pursuits, I was driven not just by duty, but, if I'm honest, also by fear. Fear of failing my father, fear of appearing weak, and perhaps a more nebulous fear, too. I had been raised to believe our house's continued dominance was a bulwark against chaos. Small c, not just the ruinous powers, though those too lurked where weakness festered. If our house fell, Maltheria Prime itself might fall into anarchy. Or so the rhetoric went. It may sound arrogant, but consider history. When great houses collapse, their worlds often burn in the aftermath, torn apart by power struggles or opportunistic invasions. Father would remind me that our lofty position was not just privilege, it was obligation. "We keep the world running, boy," he growled at me once. "If we falter, this hive will tear itself apart, and our people will feed on each other in the dark." He wasn't entirely wrong. In a hive of untold billions, order is razor fragile. The planetary governor, my father in our case, rules by the emperor's mandate, but also by maintaining a delicate balance of fear and hope among the population. A whisper of rebellion, a day's missed meals, a rumor of plague. Any of these can spark unrest that, if unchecked, could cascade into hive-wide revolt. We had seen it happen on other worlds, grim hololithic news of distant upheavals swiftly corrected by the Astra Militarum, or cautionary tales of a governor who lost control and subsequently lost his head, or was dragged off to some penal legion or quietly disappeared by the Officio Assassinorum. I knew from early on the Imperium might grant us great autonomy on our world, but there are limits. Fail to deliver the expected tithes, allow heresy or mutation to fester, let disorder reign, and the wrath of Terra would find its way to our doorstep eventually. That threat hung in the background of our luxury like a distant guillotine. Thus, as I grew into adulthood, I understood that my life of privilege was built on a foundation of countless human lives toiling below, and that my family's rule persisted only at the pleasure of mightier powers above, the Administratum, the Inquisition, the Adeptus Arbites, who enforce imperial law. Wealth and power, yes, we had those in spades, but only so long as we played our part in the grand game of the Imperium. And play it we did, or so we thought. I was in my 23rd year when fate and malice forced me to put all those lessons into practice. My father, Lord Antonidas, had ruled Maltheria Prime firmly for over 40 standard years. He was still in his prime by noble standards, kept vigorous by expensive juvenate treatments and an iron will. Many assumed he would lead our house for decades more before I took the mantle, but destiny had other plans. It happened during the Harvestide Festival, an annual celebration in Hive Eterna when nobles and commoners alike give thanks for the Emperor's bounty and more tangibly mark the tallying of the year's tithes. Father insisted on a grand banquet in the upper spire, inviting the heads of all major houses to dine at our table. It was a glittering affair, our dining hall bedecked with silken banners and flickering hololithic chandeliers depicting saints and victories. Servitors in formal livery drifted between tables, bearing platters of exotic meats and carafes of thousand-year-old amasec. I remember the aroma of spiced groks and truffle stimulating even my jaded appetite. The hall echoed with polite laughter and the clink of crystal goblets. But underneath the mirthful veneer, every guest watched every other for the slightest misstep. I recall leaning over to murmur a witty aside to Lady Salantia of House Marnek, one of our allied families, when I heard a sharp gasp further down the table. I turned to see my father standing, clutching his throat. His face had gone ashen, his eyes bulged with a mix of anger and agony. In an instant, he toppled forward, smashing a priceless porcelain dish as he fell. Time seemed to slow. I was on my feet, as were others. Father convulsed on the marble floor. Froth flecked his lips. Poison. It had to be. Despite all our precautions, someone had poisoned him in the heart of our own palace, in the middle of a banquet with every prominent noble watching. Chaos erupted. Some guests recoiled in shock, others barked orders or accusations. Our house physician, an elderly medicae adept with a cadre of servo-medics, rushed to the Lord Governor's side. I knelt by my father, calling his name, but his eyes were rolled back, breath coming in wet gurgles. The warmth was draining from his hand in mine. He gave one last spasm, then lay frighteningly still. The physician looked up at me, stricken. "My lord, he's gone!" A part of me wanted to howl in grief and rage, but another part, the part father had tempered all those years, went cold and sharp as a blade. I rose to my feet, trembling with fury but mind racing. An assassination in front of the entire assembled nobility. This was not only murder, it was a coup in all but name. The killer could be among the guests or a servant suborned. Protocol would demand investigations and proofs, but I knew if I showed any indecision now, our rivals would smell blood, literally, and pounce. I forced my voice to carry out over the clamor. "Seal the hall," I barked. "No one leaves." My personal guards, the silent sentinels, snapped into action, bolting the grand doors and training their hellguns on the assemblage. Some of the nobles bristled at being treated like common suspects, but I didn't care. House Rohirrim's rule was at stake. "Anathiel," I snapped to our master of house, essentially our chief steward and security coordinator, a retired arbitrator himself. "Take charge of finding the poisoner, now." He bowed and immediately began coordinating with the household security and enforcers to search the serving staff and test the food and drink for contaminants. The guests murmured, shifted uneasily. Outwardly, I maintained a facade of command, but inwardly my heart thundered and a sick part of me wondered if the poison had been meant for me as well. Was the wine in my own cup tainted? Father had been sharing a toast with the head of House Vorlex moments before he collapsed. House Vorlex. Yes. Lord Gaius Vorlex stood across the table, flanked by two of his sons. I noted his expression. Wide-eyed shock and something else. Was that a flicker of satisfaction at the edge of his eyes? Our houses had been at odds for years. The Vorlexes coveted our position fiercely. It would be exactly Gaius's style to strike at a public event, dramatic and irreversible. I locked eyes with him. For an instant, the hall fell silent, and in that silence I saw truth. He did not look nearly surprised enough. There was calculation in his gaze. I became certain it was him. But I needed confirmation, and I had to act carefully. Servitors collected goblets and dishes under guard to test for toxins. Panic and outrage simmered among the guests. Accusations flew between rival families. Meanwhile, I knelt again by Father's body and, with great pain in my heart, unclasped the signet ring from his limp hand, the ring bearing our house Aquila and signifying planetary authority. My hands shook only slightly as I slid it onto my own finger. There was no time for ceremony, but a few nearby saw it and their expressions shifted. The transfer of power had wordlessly begun. A minor detail stands out from that nightmare. As I rose, my eyes met those of my younger brother, Octavian. He was standing behind me, face pale, fists clenched. At the time, I read his look as shock and grief. In hindsight, well, I will get to that. After perhaps an hour of intense searching, Anathiel and the physician discovered the method. A vial of a virulent toxin, a derivative of Kulian cadmium, they said, in a decanter of amasec that had been served to my father's table. By the Emperor's grace or the plotter's design, only Father's goblet had a lethal dose. One other nearby noble had sipped from that decanter and fallen merely ill. Under harsh interrogation, my guards did not scruple to use electroprods in that moment. A serving girl confessed she'd been paid a heavy purse of thrones to ensure Lord Rohirrim's cup was filled from a particular bottle. She claimed tearfully not to know what was in it. Perhaps she truly didn't. She named the man who gave her the bribe, a courier in House Vorlex's employ. That was enough for me. All eyes turned to Lord Gaius Vorlex. The room tensed, every rivalry momentarily forgotten as they awaited my reaction. Gaius blustered, denying involvement, accusing me of trying to scapegoat him. But the evidence, circumstantial yet damning, was clear to everyone. In noble circles, we rarely get a servant foolish enough to name names. That the girl did was as good as a signed confession for Vorlex's culpability. The other nobles, even those not fond of my house, could see Vorlex had moved against us. It was a flagrant breach of the Pax Imperialis that forbids open conflict between imperial houses. If proven, Vorlex would face ruin. If I acted swiftly, I had to capitalize immediately. My father's body lay cooling at my feet, and my world teetered on chaos. There would be no protracted trial or appeal to higher authority. Such things could take months or years, time in which our enemies would tear us apart, or the planet itself might descend into civil war. No, I had to settle this here and now, while the horror was fresh and before any other faction nursed treacherous ideas about our weakened state. "Lord Gaius Vorlex," I announced, my voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling, surprisingly steady given the storm inside me. "You stand accused of high treason against the Emperor's peace and the lawful master of Maltheria Prime. The penalty for such treason is death." Gasps rose around the hall. Gaius's eyes widened, and in unison his two sons stepped forward as if to shield him. Several other nobles recoiled. Others looked to see how I would enforce this pronouncement. "This is outrageous," Gaius spat, sweating now. "You have no authority to—" "I am the authority now," I cut him off, cold as the marble beneath us. I held up my father's signet ring for all to see. Technically, I had not yet been officially confirmed as planetary governor. That required a formal investiture and a communique to Segmentum Command. But none of that mattered at this moment. Power was mine if I dared to claim it. And I did. Gaius made his final mistake. He reached for a weapon. I caught the glint of a needler pistol as his hand slipped into his coat. Perhaps he meant to take a desperate shot at me or at the witnesses. He never got the chance. A las beam cracked across the hall, and Lord Vorlex collapsed, half his head reduced to a charred ruin. My captain of the guard lowered his smoking hellgun. In the shocked hush that followed, one of Vorlex's sons, the rash one, gave a roar of despair and charged at me with a dinner knife. He didn't make it halfway. Half a dozen las guns cut him down, and he skidded to a lifeless stop at my feet. The other son dropped to his knees, trembling, hands raised in surrender. He was wise enough to know it was over. Just like that, it was done. The would-be usurper lay dead among spilled wine and shattered china. The assembled nobility looked on in stunned silence. Bloodshed at a formal feast is not entirely unheard of in our history, but the summary execution of a great house's patriarch in front of everyone, by the new heir no less, was dramatic and dire beyond memory. I surveyed the hall. In that moment I knew any sign of weakness from me would be fatal, so I channeled every ounce of authority ingrained in me and spoke with deadly calm. "House Vorlex has betrayed the Emperor's trust. Let all who harbor similar ambitions take heed. This is the fate of traitors." I nodded to my guards. They moved swiftly to apprehend the surviving Vorlex son and any of their attendants. Later, I saw to it that the remaining Vorlex family members were stripped of titles and exiled off-world to some distant penal colony. Eliminating every last member of a noble line can be politically messy. I opted for a measured cruelty. Their name would continue in disgrace somewhere on the fringes of the galaxy, while all their holdings and wealth were forfeit to the Imperium. Naturally, much of those holdings quietly found their way into the hands of houses who had stood by us as rewards. One must buy loyalty where one can. The banquet, as you can imagine, ended swiftly and grimly. The guests were allowed to depart under guard one by one. Many bowed to me with newfound deference, some genuine, some deeply grudging, acknowledging me as planetary governor and head of House Rorim in one fell swoop. I had passed a deadly trial by fire and seized the reins of power with both hands. I stood there in the aftermath next to my father's shrouded corpse, which attendants were gently lifting. The lovely orchestral music that had been playing was long silenced. The only sounds were the crackling of a toppled candelabra and the distant sobbing of a terrified servant. I remember the mingled scents of spiced wine and the iron tang of blood in the air. It should have been a scene from a nightmare, and indeed part of me was reeling with grief. I had just lost my father, brutally and without farewell, but another part of me felt a grim vindication. The old man had hammered his lessons into me for this very scenario, and I had delivered. I had acted without hesitation, as he taught me. I had shown strength, decisiveness, and eliminated the enemy. It dawned on me that night that I was truly alone at the top now, and that I was ready. Later that night, I sat in Father's, no, my, study, beneath the stern gaze of his portrait. I had already dispatched urgent astropathic messages to the sector capital, informing them of the unfortunate demise of Governor Rorim and the succession of his rightful heir, me. Formalities mostly. Barring any objections, I would receive official confirmation of my title in due course. I doubted anyone in the administratum cared terribly that one imperial commander died and his son took over, so long as our tithes didn't lapse. I also contacted the Adeptus Arbites Provost on World and provided a concise report of the Vorlex treachery and our response. The Arbites, concerned with strict imperial law, would normally frown on nobles slaughtering each other. But I had the convenient cover of a foiled coup, and I promised a generous contribution to the Arbites Armory Fund. Amazing how a few million thrones smooth over legal wrinkles. Thus, the matter was largely settled. House Vorlex, an old rival, wiped out under the guise of imperial justice. The Arbites got credit for resolving a treasonous conspiracy with our cooperation. The administratum got assurances of continued stability, and I got, well, rid of a major threat. In the flickering candlelight, I kept only candles burning that night. The glow globes felt too harsh for my mood. I noticed my reflection in a glass cabinet door. I was still in my blood-splattered banquet attire, a solitary specter seated in my father's high-backed chair. I looked very pale and very young, a 23-year-old with a dead man's heavy ring on his finger and the weight of a world on his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't sure what emotion my face showed. Triumph? Sorrow? Exhaustion? Perhaps all at once. I poured a glass of Amasec from an unopened bottle I picked and unsealed myself, trust no one, and raised it in a toast to the empty room. To the Emperor, I whispered, because that's what one says. In my heart, I think I was really toasting my father, and perhaps also myself, to surviving. Yet the events of that night were not entirely concluded with Vorlex's execution. A loose end remained, a personal betrayal that cut far deeper than the public one. I speak of my brother, Octavian. In the days that followed, as I settled into my role as planetary governor, the investigation into the poison plot continued quietly. Publicly, I left it to the Arbites to appear impartial. But privately, my new spy master and interrogators worked tirelessly to trace every thread. The serving girl's testimony had been a start. We discovered the Vorlex courier who bribed her had conveniently vanished, likely disposed of by his masters once his part was done. But digging into his last known associates turned up an unsettling lead. Vorlex had an informant close to our family, a mole who provided timing and access. Someone within House Rorim's inner circle had helped orchestrate the assassination. I was furious at the thought. We Rorims prided ourselves on loyalty, enforced by fear or reward, but loyalty nonetheless. Who among us had sold us out? Initially, I suspected perhaps a senior servant, father's valet, or our master of kitchen. But as my interrogators tightened the screws, sometimes literally, on captured Vorlex retainers, an awful truth emerged. One whimpering Vorlex serf, under agonizer torture, babbled that the inside man was a young noble with everything to gain from Lord Antonitus's death, someone who had met with Lord Gaius Vorlex in secret. I remember sitting very still when they told me this. The pieces fell together with chilling clarity. A young noble in our household. Who else could it be but Octavian, my own brother? Jealous? Manipulated by Vorlex's promises? Whatever the case, it appeared he had a hand in patricide. I had to be sure. I confronted Octavian privately in the solarium atop the spire at dusk the next day. It was one of our childhood favorite spots, a glass-domed observatory filled with rare flowering vines, with a panoramic view of the hive's twilight skyline. We used to play Regicide, the board game, there under our tutor's eye, or just watch the sun sink below the smog. It seemed a fitting stage for what was to come. He arrived warily, perhaps sensing something was off. I had dismissed all servants and guards from the vicinity. It was just the two of us amid the golden glow filtering through stained glass. For a moment, with him standing there in his fine coat and polished boots, I saw the little boy I'd once given piggyback rides to, the kid I'd protected from a bully tutor years ago. Perhaps he saw something in my face, too, because he attempted a smile. "Brother," he began cautiously, "you wanted to talk?" I poured 2 glasses of wine from a decanter. One I had personally ensured was clean. I handed one to him. My voice sounded almost gentle. "It's been a trying week, Octavian. We haven't had a chance to speak since Father's murder." He accepted the glass, eyes darting. "A terrible shock," he murmured. If he was guilty, he had gall to play the innocent. Perhaps he thought with Vorlex dead, the trail back to him was cut. I sipped my wine and continued quietly. "They tell me there was a conspiracy, not just Vorlex acting alone, that he had help inside our house. I did not take my eyes off him. Can you imagine? A traitor in our own blood." Octavian went very still. His hand holding the glass trembled just a touch. What are you implying, Septimus? Surely you don't think I let silence answer, my gaze boring into his. I saw fear blooming in his eyes, and then desperation. Denial turned to anger in a flash. "This is absurd," he snarled, lowering the glass. "How dare you accuse me? I loved Father. It's you. You always wanted me out of the picture." His right hand drifted near his belt. I knew he carried a little lass pistol there, a habit Father ironically encouraged in both of us. I was prepared. A slender stiletto blade rested up my sleeve. Firearms would make noise. I preferred something quieter. Moreover, I felt this deed, if deed it must be, should be intimate. He saw the resolve in my eyes, and in a last burst of panic, he went for his pistol. But I was faster. Grief and fury gave me speed. In 2 quick strides, I was upon him. My left hand seized his wrist before the gun cleared his coat, and my right thrust the stiletto up under his ribcage, angled toward the heart, just as I'd been taught all those years ago. A perfect thrust. Octavian gasped, eyes wide in shock. The small pistol clattered to the floor as he staggered back, blood staining his brocaded vest. But brother," he wheezed. I'm not sure if he was about to plead or curse. I didn't let him finish. I stepped forward, yanked him close by his collar, and in one swift motion slit his throat. His blood sprayed warm across my hands and face. He gurgled and collapsed to the mosaic floor, eyes glassy, life pooling scarlet around him. I stood over his body, breathing hard, heart thudding. A strange calm came over me. Some would expect horror or sorrow to overwhelm me after killing my own sibling, but all I felt was a weary resignation and grim closure. If Octavian had ever truly loved our family, that part of him had died long before I drew my blade. He chose ambition and resentment over blood, and I answered in kind. Of course, officially, my brother's death was explained differently. The story released to the public was that he took his own life in despair over father's assassination, a tragic footnote to the greater tragedy. A convenient story that made our house seem poignantly stricken but united rather than riven by betrayal. We held a small funeral for Octavian, closed coffin of course. The whispers in court likely guessed at the truth. Nobles are adept at smelling out foul play, but none dared speak it. A few of the more pious offered me perfunctory condolences like, "The Emperor knows his own, Governor. Take comfort that your brother is in his hands now." I nodded gravely each time, playing the role of bereaved sibling. In the span of a week, I had lost my father to treachery, executed a rival lord, and personally killed my own brother for betrayal. I had spilled more highborn blood in those days than many peers do in a lifetime. The dark life of a richest man indeed, and my rule had only just begun. When the dust settled, House Rorim emerged battered but unbowed. In fact, in some ways we were stronger. With Vorlek's lands and assets seized, our holdings expanded overnight. The other noble houses, even those who disliked or feared us, were cowed by the ferocity of my ascent. None wished to become the next example. They smiled and pledged loyalty anew, even as they shuddered at what I'd proven capable of. One might call me heartless for handling matters as I did. Perhaps I was. But understand this. In the Imperium, mercy is a luxury even the mighty cannot afford when survival is on the line. I took no pleasure in killing Octavian. Well, perhaps a cold satisfaction, but not joy. It had to be done. Mercy to him would have meant death for me, and chaos for our world in the ensuing struggle, which could have cost untold more lives. That is what I tell myself on the rare nights my conscience stirs. By cutting out the cancer in my family swiftly, I spared our planet a civil war or a punitive intervention from above. So there I was, in my early 20s, the new Lord Governor of Maltheria Prime, scion of one of the richest houses in the sector, and quite alone. My father gone, my brother gone, my enemies, for the moment, dealt with. I had seized power and kept it through decisive brutality, proving I could play this game of thrones with the deadliest of them. The High Lords on Terra likely wouldn't even hear the details, just another routine planetary succession with a footnote about internal political adjustments. To the wider Imperium, it was a non-event. But on Maltheria Prime, my name suddenly carried a near-mythic aura. Septimus Rorim, the young lion who avenged his father and purged the traitors in one fell swoop. In the manufactorum, barracks, and underhive drinking holes, gossips and minstrels spun tales of how I stared down a hall of nobles and struck like thunder. No doubt the story grew grander with each telling. I later heard one version that claimed I dueled Lord Vorlex in single combat with power swords, which is laughably untrue, but far be it from me to spoil a good legend. Let the people have their legends. They serve a purpose. Fear and admiration among the populace are as useful for maintaining order as any regiment of troops. After ascending to power in such a blaze of violence, one might expect the rest of my life to seem anticlimactic. Hardly. In truth, the real challenges were only beginning. Seizing a throne is one thing. Keeping it, ruling, is quite another. Now I had to live the life all my wealth and status had been building toward, the dark life of one of the richest and most powerful individuals in a far-flung corner of the Imperium. I had craved being in control, holding the reins of my own fate and that of my world. Well, now I sat in the high saddle and every eye, friend, foe, and unseen alike, was on me. If I faltered, if I showed weakness, the sharks would circle again. And beyond them, the greater threats. The Imperium itself has no patience for failed governors, and the galaxy's horrors have no mercy for weak leaders. I steeled myself. On the day of my formal investiture as planetary governor, a ceremony equal parts pomp and piety, attended by all the notables and presided over by that same cardinal who eulogized Father, I knelt and swore the oaths to the golden throne. I pledged to uphold the laws, pay the tithes, defend the planet, and so on, all the scripted vows every governor recites. My voice echoed through the incense-laden air. By the throne I so swear. As I rose, amid thunderous chants of Deo gratias and glory to the governor, I caught the cardinal smiling at me with a knowing gleam. Perhaps he saw the steel in me then, or maybe he was just picturing the hefty donation I'd promised the ecclesiarchy in gratitude for their support during the crisis. The emperor's work is never done, as they say. Thus began my reign. If I thought I already understood the depths of noble decadence and intrigue, I soon learned I had only skimmed the surface. With absolute power in my hands and a vast fortune at my disposal, the stage was set to explore just how deep the abyss of indulgence and tyranny could go. To rule a hive world and count oneself among the most affluent souls in the galaxy is to live in a paradox, a life of unparalleled luxury, yet one of unimaginable pressure. After the tumult of my succession, day-to-day life settled into something that, from the outside, many would call idyllic, even enviable. But let me peel back the gilded veneer for you. Picture this. I wake in a colossal canopied bed of silk and velvet, the fabric spun by the finest artisans of a pleasure world and embroidered with the golden aquila. My sleeping chamber perches at the apex of the spire. One wall is a transparency, a meter-thick armor crystal window, looking out over cloud banks of pollution. It simulates a view my smog-choked planet no longer naturally provides. The moment I stir, hidden cogitator sensors register my biometrics and silently signal my attendance. A pair of silent servitors glide in, once human, now lobotomized and fitted with bronze plating, to serve me. They move with machine precision, adjusting the room's temperature, laying out my garments for the day. Human attendants arrive as well, a young woman and man, each chosen for attractiveness and impeccable training, and each implanted with loyalty governors in the brain to ensure obedience. They murmur, "Good morning, my lord," and avert their eyes modestly. One carefully sets a steaming cup of recaf on my nightstand, brewed from beans grown on a distant agri-world where soil is still fertile and sun still gentle. Only the best for the Lord of the Spire. It's a trivial thing, that first cup of recaf, but a ritual I genuinely enjoy. The rich aroma, the warmth. It reminds me I'm still human enough to appreciate simple pleasures. Not that anything about my mornings is truly simple. Even the water for my bath is special. Other attendants test it for toxins or contaminants. Paranoia is routine now, before I step in. The bath itself is a sunken marble pool inlaid with gold. I bathe in water imported from off-world. Literally, we haul in pure glacier meltwater from a nearby moon because the local reservoirs, though filtered, are considered too harsh for noble skin. Decadent? Absolutely. But in our circle, if you aren't wasting obscene resources on your comfort, you're thought either miserly or slipping in influence. Among the high-born, pointless extravagance is a badge of status. As I soak, a servo skull, the sanctified skull of a long-dead advisor fitted with voxcaster and cogitator, hovers nearby, intoning my morning agenda in a respectful monotone. It recites a litany of appointments, an administratum envoy petitioning for increased promethium output, a luncheon with Lady Salantia, yes, the same, now Dowager of House Marnik, to finalize a trade deal, an inspection tour of the upper manufactorum levels in the afternoon, and in the evening a grand ball at the palace. Always there are balls, banquets, and soirees. The social machinery of power never rests. I half listen while another servant, a cosmetician with cybernetic eyes for detail, fusses over my appearance. He trims my hair, files my nails, ensures I'm impeccably groomed. He is one of the few long-serving staff I trust as much as one can trust any servant. He's been with our family since my father's time. Even so, I don't forget caution. The shears he uses have a micro-lock keyed to my biometrics, disengaging only when both he and I are verified. It wouldn't do to have a disgruntled barber take an ear or a throat as revenge. Every instrument around me, even a barber's tool, is a potential threat accounted for. This is the level of vigilance that underpins each day of my life. Every utensil, every piece of furniture in my vicinity has been inspected, secured, often weaponized in my favor. Discrete panels in the walls of nearly every room can deploy turrets or emit nerve gas at a moment's notice, coded to spare me, of course. One of my interior designers once jokingly called the aesthetic militarized Baroque. He wasn't wrong. From the bath, I dress in attire befitting my station, not ostentatious robes, those are for ceremonies, but a superbly tailored suit of midnight blue with subtle gold thread. It appears to be fine brocade, but beneath the silk is a micro-mesh that can stiffen on impact, light body armor to stop a needle round or shrapnel without ruining the cut. I clasp on my signet ring and a few tasteful pieces of jewelry. Each is actually a hidden device. One ring conceals a venomous needle. A jeweled brooch doubles as a panic beacon that can summon my guards at need. In the Imperium's upper crust, fashion and security go hand in hand. Thus armored in silk and gold, I step out to break my fast. Breakfast is served in a small dining salon overlooking the Spire Gardens. It is, naturally, lavish. Crystal dishes of off-world fruit, fresh-baked pastries made with real sugar and Grox milk butter, recaf as well as imported Tana tea, and grilled Grox meat sausages seasoned with spices from a half-dozen different planets. I often eat lightly despite the abundance. Decadence can ironically make one apathetic to food. Still, my chefs strive to tempt me. Calidus omelettes whipped from rare sea dragon eggs, or sweet pastries filled with creams that cost a menial's yearly wage per bite. Often I'm joined at breakfast by a favored few, perhaps a visiting rogue trader regaling me with tales of some far frontier, or the colonel of the Planetary Defense Force giving a status report, or a high-ranking magistratum official seeking favor. We exchange pleasantries as we nibble. Over flaky pastries, I'll listen to the colonel's update on new recruits. Enlistment from the lower Hab blocks is up 5%, my lord. Starvation remains our most persuasive recruiter, he notes wryly, and I chuckle at the grim humor. Or I'll hear the magistratum judge's plea for more Arbites patrols in the mid-hive, while I pretend to consider it, knowing full well I've already allocated resources elsewhere. I smile and respond with practiced wit, but a part of me stands aside internally and observes the absurdity. Here we sit in opulence beyond measure, casually discussing dispatching thousands of troops to war or adjusting grain rations that will decide whether millions eat or starve, all while nibbling on fruit tarts and sipping fragrant tea. It's a grotesque parody of a bygone idyll, civilized people making civilized conversation in a world built on uncivilized suffering. After breakfast, I make a brief tour through what I call the Hall of Whispers, essentially my operations center, a circular chamber deep in the palace where my advisors and information officers gather to brief me. There, beneath gilded cherub statues and frescoes of imperial victories, we monitor the very heartbeat of the hive, and by extension, the planet. Holoscreens project administratum reports and pict feeds from key areas. Adept scribes drone out statistics of production yields, population counts, infraction reports. My spymaster, a sallow man with an augmetic monocle that can read micro-expressions, gives me the overnight rundown. Minor gang skirmishes in the underhive. Nothing unusual. The gangs cull each other as a matter of course. A sudden increase in circulation of a narcotic called dust, flagged for investigation in case a new syndicate or off-world cartel is muscling in. The status of a few key individuals under surveillance, a firebrand preacher in the lower hive who might need silencing soon, a discontent manufacturum overseer who bears watching, an underhive gang boss turning oddly pious, etc. There's also intelligence from off-world. A neighboring system's agri-world suffered a bad harvest, meaning our tithe quotas may be raised next cycle to compensate. And a whisper that a small Chaos Reaver warband was sighted 2 sectors away, a reminder to quietly ensure our orbital defenses and PDF regiments remain at readiness. All these bits of information flow across my data slate every morning. These are the types of issues I must address every day. For instance, only a month ago, my agents uncovered that a hive transit overseer had been siphoning off imperial grain shipments to sell for personal profit. I ordered him and his entire ring of conspirators publicly executed, hanged from the upper transit rails for all to see, and their bodies rendered into extra ration bars for the workers. A harsh lesson, perhaps, but after that, production figures snapped back in line. This is how one governs, through swift, memorable examples. My spymaster's reports often come with actionable suggestions, which I approve or modify on the spot. That very morning, for instance, he flags an administratum tally clerk whose grain ledgers show anomalies. By noon, that clerk will be in an arbitessus interrogation cell confessing his fraud. Such decisive action is routine in my administration. I've become a master of triage, knowing which issue requires my personal intervention versus which can be delegated, which potential fire needs stamping out now, which can be allowed to burn a bit longer for some advantage or purge. If an underhive gang war eliminates a troublesome mutant cult, I might let it rage a while before sending in the enforcers. If a particular noble ally grows too ambitious, perhaps he'll suffer a sudden trade setback, or an administratum tax audit at my quiet behest. Everything is a piece on the board to be moved, sacrificed, or spared as needed. Much of my day, then, is spent in one way or another managing the strings of a vast puppet show. The hive, indeed the entire planet, is my stage, and I must ensure each actor knows their part or suffer the consequences. But power is not maintained by paperwork and paranoia alone. There is also the matter of public image. As planetary lord, I must be visible to my subjects, at least symbolically, and to my peers. That means ceremonies, public addresses, social events, a constant performance to reinforce the narrative that keeps the population in line. Take, for example, the Glorium March I instituted on the anniversary of my ascension. Each year on that date, I descend from the spire in a grand procession. I ride in an ornate grav carriage, a hovering palanquin of gold filigree flanked by gilded cyber lions that roar incense. We process through a secured pathway of the upper hive, and a carefully screened crowd of mid-hive citizens is permitted to line the route. They cheer, the loudest cheers coming from paid agitators and those under threat to perform. Though some genuine adulation exists, life under my rule has been relatively stable, which common folk appreciate in their own desperate way. I arrive at the great plaza of St. Drusus, and deliver a rousing speech about duty, the Emperor's grace, how every citizen's labor is a sacred service, etc. It's the usual rhetoric. I could recite it from memory at this point, but it serves its purpose. The masses need to see me as an almost demigod figure, yet also hear that I care about their toil and devotion. I even allow a pre-selected handful of exemplary workers to receive personal commendations, kneeling, trembling, as I pin medals on their threadbare uniforms and declare them heroes of the hive. Some weep with joy at the attention. I offer a benevolent smile. Cameras capture it all for the planetary voxcasts. Then I return to my world of luxury, and they return to the grindstone, likely to be mugged on their way home or extorted by their overseer for daring to miss a shift. Such is the farce we call inspiring the populace. Grimly amusing, if it weren't so tragic. Meanwhile, with the populace pacified by occasional bread and circuses, well, not much bread, they mostly subsist on flavorless nutrient paste and protein recycled from corpse starch. But at least I ensure their rations are met and relatively fair. I'm not completely heartless. I prefer my people alive and productive. I turn to the entertainments of my own class. Here is where the darkness truly seeps in. The wealthiest nobles of a hive world have seemingly unlimited avenues of indulgence at their fingertips. After you've secured power and set up the machinery to keep it, what do you do with your time? The answer for many is whatever in the Emperor's name you want. And often what they want grows twisted over time. Boredom is a formidable devil. It drives even outwardly pious aristocrats into strange perversities. I have witnessed, and if I'm candid, partaken in, diversions that would astonish and appall the less fortunate. In the early years of my rule, I kept things relatively tame by noble standards. Grand dinner parties, refined musical soirees, elegant hunts. For instance, I would host a weekly salon where each course was a rare delicacy from a different world. My attempt at cultured gathering. Conversation would remain polite, centering on art, trade, maybe harmless gossip. We'd have a string quartet playing softly, maybe an acrobat from off-world performing gravity-defying feats between courses. All very civilized on the surface. Meanwhile, under the table, so to speak, all manner of intrigue simmered. Furtive business deals, whispered proposals of marriage alliances, subtle mockery disguised as flattery. A noble gathering is a battlefield with canapes and wine instead of bolters. But the casualties, reputations, alliances are quite real. However, as the years passed, I found such salons almost quaint. My peers hungered for more stimulation, more thrill, so our events evolved. Formal dinners gave way occasionally to masquerade balls of increasing debauchery. Imagine hundreds of lords and ladies in ornate costumes and masks. We love our masks. Twirling in the Palatine ballroom under chem candelabras, while hidden alcoves around the hall host all manner of sordid liaisons. The finest wines and spirits flow freely. Obscura and other narcotics are offered on silver trays. In one corner, a pair of acrobats contort in a provocative performance. In another, a theater of sorts is set up, where exotic dancers or even caged creatures provide grotesque entertainment to jaded onlookers. What begins as an elegant fete often descends, by the late hours, into something between an orgy and a circus of the damned. At one particularly wild masquerade, I recall a group of bored aristocrats staging an impromptu contest. Not a duel with pistols or blades, that at least would have been honorable, but a duel of excess. One boasted he could consume an entire bottle of somnus, a potent narcotic liqueur, without passing out. Another attempted to eat a live coral snail soaked in amasec, a disgusting delicacy that can induce euphoric hallucinations if it doesn't poison you. A third participant left the ballroom and returned dragging a terrified underhive urchin boy they'd somehow smuggled in, proposing, slurring with laughter, that we all take turns grafting an augmetic onto the lad, essentially turning him into a living cyborg art piece as a party game. That line, I am proud to say, I put a stop to at once, and I had the poor wretch rushed to the medici. I'm not completely devoid of mercy. I earned some sneers from the truly depraved guests for spoiling their fun, but even I have limits to what I'll countenance. There are those among the nobility who would treat the lower folk as literal toys to mutilate on a whim. That veers too close to overt heresy and madness for my taste. And it's precisely the sort of thing that, if word got out, would spark rebellion or invite an inquisitor's gaze. In dark jest, I often reassured myself that at least none among us had yet suggested crafting our throne room furniture out of ground-up orphans or some similarly vile fancy. One hopes even our depravity has some boundary. So I walk a fine line, permitting decadence up to a point, but reining it in when it edges toward true abomination. Instead, I channeled those bloodier impulses into more constructive outlets. For example, the Grand Hunt. This became an infamous tradition under my rule. Once a year, I opened the sealed Underwild, a huge, overgrown section of Lower Hive abandoned to mutants generations ago, for a noble hunting expedition. Myself and a select group of thrill-seeking lords, armed with ornate bolt rifles and accompanied by our retinues, descend in an armored lift cage into the depths. There, among crumbling hab blocks turned to feral jungle, thick with luminescent fungi and crawling vermin, we hunt the most dangerous game available. Not man, that would be too close to kin and too simple, but close, the mutant abominations that lurk below. Over centuries, pockets of radiation and chemical waste in the Underwild have spawned subhumans and twisted beasts, gnarled things with extra limbs, plasma-bloated brutes, psychic aberrations that gibber in the dark. Normally, my enforcers purge them whenever they threaten to spread upward. But for the Grand Hunt, we herd a number of these wretches into a contained zone of ruins and then release them for sport. I recall the first hunt vividly. I stalked and killed a particularly large mutant, a bulging brute plated in chitinous scales, with a single shot from my master-crafted hunting rifle, a gift from the Adeptus Mechanicus, blessed by the tech priests. It never jams, and its rounds detonate on impact. The beast's death roar echoed through the labyrinthine underhive halls when we emerged hours later, caked in grime and victory, dragging trophies, some grotesque heads and hides. The nobles were exhilarated. It was like a twisted parody of the nightly quests of ancient myth. We toasted our kills with fine amasec from crystal flasks, standing amidst filth and decay, laughing like maniacs. It was exhilarating, I won't lie, partly because it was truly dangerous. One year, a young lordling who bragged incessantly got separated and was set upon by a pack of feral mutants. We found what was left of him later, hanging in a larder nest. The scandal was minimal. His house quietly paid me to emphasize his heroic daring in the official story rather than our collective folly, and if anything, it added to the hunt's allure. It's now a coveted invitation among the sector's elite. Bloodsport as networking opportunity. Truly, the Imperium's nobility have evolved beyond crude necessity. Such amusements serve another purpose. They harden us, or weed out the weak. The nobility must remain a bit feral themselves, or risk being devoured by the dark realities of this galaxy. That's what I tell myself when I preside over a banquet hall full of drunken peers cheering as two trained gladiators hack each other to pieces for our entertainment. Yes, I introduce that as well. Gladiatorial exhibitions in my private coliseum. They were already a thing in the underhive pits, and war prisoners often duel to the death in penal legions. I simply elevated it to high society. We take condemned criminals, murderers, recidivists, ones who in theory deserve it, and have them fight in an opulent arena under the spire. Sometimes we pit them against captured xenobeasts. Watching a feral orc squig devour a hapless felon can be quite educational about the value of discipline. Other times, to truly stir the crowd's blood, we arm both sides and promise freedom to whichever prisoner survives, giving them maximum incentive to slaughter each other for our viewing pleasure. On rare occasions, I even slip in a captured heretic cultist or renegade guardsman. The spectacle of a traitor being torn apart is always a crowd pleaser among nobles who fancy themselves loyalists. Am I painting a grim enough picture yet? The richest people in the Imperium, the local elite, we dine on fine cuisine while watching human beings butchered for sport. And we consider it culture. The first time I hosted such an event, I did feel a twinge. Not quite guilt, but a surreal sense of, what have we become? It passed quickly. It's frightening how fast one normalizes the abnormal when everyone around you is clapping and praising you for it. After all, I rationalized, these prisoners were slated for execution anyway. If their deaths could provide a night's amusement and remind our noble houses that the wages of sin is death, wasn't that practically virtuous? That's exactly what I declared in my opening speech that evening to the assembled guests. They raised their glasses and agreed. Then the killing began, and our smiles widened. Sometimes I think the only difference between us, the vaunted highborn, and the most degenerate underhive scum, is one of scale and permission. The scum slug it out in alleys over a few thrones or a half ration. We do it in ballrooms with poison words or arenas by proxy for fortunes and power. Strip away the etiquette, and it's the same primal dance of dominance. Speaking of dominance, let me not neglect how we treat those beneath us outside these entertainments. On a daily basis, the contempt the nobility holds for common folk is subtle but omnipresent. We don't, usually, go around randomly whipping peasants in the streets. Instead, our disdain is baked into the very architecture of society. The spires physically loom over the hab blocks, a literal social hierarchy in steel and stone. When I travel through the mid-hive, in armored convoys with armed escorts, naturally, the people prostrate themselves or avert their eyes. They've been taught since birth that to look directly at the radiant lord is disrespectful unless permitted. A handy custom, as it prevents them from seeing how utterly human and fallible we nobles actually are. They just see the polished convoy, the gleaming akala, the parade of gold. Workers know that if an aristocrat's vehicle comes through, their own transit pods will be halted to give us clear passage. If a noble estate requires resources, say water or power, and diverting it causes outages in the workers' district, so be it. I've signed orders rerouting energy from mid-hive habs to ensure my palace lights never flicker. Of course, I sugarcoat such decrees with flowery language about necessity and temporary sacrifice, and have my administratum adepts post notices urging everyone to tighten belts for the good of the Emperor's plan. Meanwhile, up in the spire, we barely notice a flicker of discomfort. If someone in the lower levels starves or suffocates due to these measures, well, in the grand calculus, they are easily replaced by the next generation, or an off-world labor shipment. One life means almost nothing amid billions, a fact which, ironically, we who live at the top must never publicly admit, even as our every action affirms it. I recall a glaring example. One year, a particularly severe heat wave hit the planet. Our manufactoria output so much waste heat that sometimes the atmosphere itself warms unpredictably. The hive cooling system strained to keep up, Power had to be conserved to prevent an overload. My advisors recommended rationing energy in the lowest quarters, effectively shutting down power to tens of millions of HAB units for several hours each day. I authorized it without hesitation. It was that or inconvenience the noble and industrial districts, which was unthinkable if we wanted to maintain production and, let's face it, our own comfort. So for a month, the slums sweltered in darkness every night. There were riots, of course. People suffocated in their overcrowded HABs. Enforcers had to crack skulls to maintain order. I declared a state of emergency and imposed curfews, enforced by armed patrols and servo-skull surveillance. From my cool, breezy palace, we have backup generators and heat dispersal fields to ensure our climate control never falters. I read reports each morning of how many bodies had been found in the alleys overnight. Over 20,000 by the end of that heat wave, they estimated, dead from heat stroke or related violence. 20,000 lives extinguished so that we could continue our feasts and slumber without breaking a sweat. I remember one particularly stifling evening, pouring myself a chilled glass of rare iced amasek as I reviewed those statistics. For a fleeting moment, the gross injustice of it gnawed at me. But I quieted that feeling by telling myself, if I hadn't done it, production quotas would have failed, tithes to the emperor would have faltered, and far more would suffer when the Adeptus Administratum penalized us, or when our under-equipped regiments failed on some distant battlefield for lack of supplies. Better that a few thousand useless dregs die here than a regiment at the galaxy's edge lacks less guns and ammunition. Cold logic, but not untrue. This is how we rationalize our every cruelty, by invoking the greater needs of the Imperium. The irony isn't lost on me. We preach service to humanity, even as we sacrifice huge swaths of humanity for our own convenience. In the Imperium, hypocrisy is more plentiful than Prometheum. Yet, for all that, I maintain a careful balance. My forebears taught me that naked oppression without end leads to rebellion, which leads to ruin, and one's own neck on an execution block. So I allow some safety valves. For instance, I support the existence of joy squares, designated mid-hive districts where workers can spend their meager pay on cheap booze, gambling, or carnal pleasures. It keeps them docile, their frustrations dissipated in the approved venues. I also make public shows of charity now and then, funding an infirmary here, a food distribution there. Nothing that truly shifts the paradigm of their suffering, of course, but enough to paint me as a benevolent lord in the propaganda. It's management by theater. Keep them alive, give them just enough hope or distraction that they don't unite in despair. I read somewhere, in a heretical text confiscated by my agents, ironically, a quote that stuck with me. The last function of kings is to give those who must obey them illusions to live by. I'd amend that the function of any ruler in the Imperium is to give the ruled illusions. Illusions that their toil matters, that their leaders care, that the God Emperor himself notes their devotion. Without those illusions, the abyss of reality, the war, the hunger, the insignificance of the individual would devour all. On particularly reflective days, I almost pity the common folk. Their lives are so brutal, so short. Most are born, slave away in obscurity, and die without seeing a fraction of the wonders I have. They'll never leave the confines of their hive city or agri-farm. They know nothing beyond what we allow them to know. In a way, their ignorance is enforced bliss. Were they to truly see how we live, to smell the rose gardens on my balcony, sipping water purer than they'll ever taste, to witness the obscene waste at one of our feasts, they might burn this planet down in righteous fury. And truth be told, I wouldn't entirely blame them if they tried. But they won't see it. I make sure those worlds remain separate. The Spire is practically a different planet from the Underhive. We share the same rock, only in a theoretical sense. So I wear my mask of the gracious Lord by day, making appearances, signing decrees, performing the gestures that keep the wheels turning. By night or in private, I indulge in the fruits of power that I've earned, or been cursed with, depending on perspective. It's a cycle of public duty and private decadence. And all the while, beyond the marble walls and stained glass windows of my palace, the great machine of Maltharia Prime churns on, billions of souls laboring in factory lines that never cease, forging munitions, armor, and supplies for wars they'll never see. They live and die under a dull red sky, dreaming perhaps of a better life that will never come, except for the lucky few who claw into mid-hive clerical positions or emperor uplift them, catch the eye of a noble recruiter to become household servants. A double-edged sword, since then they glimpse our splendor, but risk much as well. It's a dark life for them, and a dark life for us, just in different shades. The darkness that engulfs we wealthy is of the soul, moral decay behind silk curtains. The darkness that swallows the masses is of the body and spirit. Endless drudgery, life ground down to grist. In the end, perhaps we're all damned in this Imperium. Only some of us have comfortable chairs to sit in on our way to damnation. I realize I may sound overly cynical, even disillusioned. On the contrary, I remain a firm believer in the Imperium's grand purpose. One must, if one wishes to sleep at night. I make a point of daily prayer in the palace's private chapel, a beautifully adorned sanctum with golden aquilae and statues of saints. I kneel on a velvet cushion, yes, even prayer has its luxuries here, and recite the prescribed litanies. O throne, guide your servant, make me a worthy instrument of your will. Those words leave my lips, and sometimes I almost mean them sincerely. I project the image of the devout, dutiful governor, because belief is a powerful tool. Many times I've had to make profoundly unholy decisions, but I justify them as necessary for the emperor's realm. The ecclesiarchy officials on world, the cardinal and his swarm of priests, are content with me. I fund their cathedrals and give them no cause to doubt my piety. Occasionally I even partake in the more ostentatious rites. Once, during a grand Thanksgiving Mass, I personally carried a holy relic, supposedly a finger bone of some ancient confessor, through throngs of chanting citizens. I held it high, face a mask of reverence, while people reached out as if I were a vessel of the divine. In that moment, I realized that, for all my cynicism, I am part of a vast play that keeps humanity going. We all enact these roles, the benevolent lord, the faithful flock, because if we didn't, the despair and horror of reality would drive everyone mad. Thus faith, genuine or feigned, is another currency, and I spend it wisely. I commission beautiful icons, quote scripture in speeches, allow the ministorum its share of pomp and influence. In return, they legitimize me. The cardinal preaches that I am emperor-appointed and must be obeyed so long as I am just. Justice, of course, conveniently defined by those of us in power, but the masses like the word. One might wonder, do I ever tire of it? The hedonism, the scheming, the endless double faces? The answer is complicated. At times, yes, a weariness creeps in. There are nights I stand on my balcony after some debauched gathering has ended, the twin moons shining sickly through the haze, and I feel a hollow ache. Surrounded by wealth and sycophants, yet fundamentally alone and empty, perhaps. On those nights I sometimes recall a simpler memory. Not that I ever had a truly simple life, but a moment of relative innocence. I think of a morning during my youth when I watched from the spire as the hive's chimneys belched smoke into a pale sunrise, and I wondered what it would be like to be a common citizen just starting a day's honest work, not scheming or fearing or hurting anyone. There's a certain bliss in not bearing the weight of a world on your shoulders or blood on your hands. But such thoughts usually pass quickly. I'm a creature of this life through and through. I doubt I could function as anything else if fate gave me the chance. And then, inevitably, duty or danger snaps me out of such melancholy. A vox call from an urgent council meeting, or an alarm ping from the securitor monitors. Because, you see, the life of the richest is not all idle stagnation. Crises do come, even to us, with stakes as high as they can be. The galaxy has a way of reminding even the mightiest that we are not truly safe or all-powerful. My reminder came some years into my reign in the form of an invasion. The first sign was ominous reports from outer system picket stations. A greenskin fleet, orcs, was on approach. A conglomeration of ramshackle warships, massive and crudely built, drifting toward Maltheria Prime after overrunning a frontier outpost. Orcs are drawn to war like moths to flame, and a bustling hive world like ours must have shone bright in whatever passes for their minds. I still recall the chill that seized me when the master of astropaths delivered the decoded warning, "Wah," on approach. That guttural term spelled nightmare. This wasn't a raid. Our long-range auspex counted dozens of vessels. A full-scale Wah, orc invasion, was coming. We had mere weeks to prepare. In theory, every Imperial planet maintains defenses and a planetary defense force, a PDF, for just such an event. In practice, after centuries of relative peace, complacency had set in. Yes, we had void shields protecting the hives and defense laser batteries and a standing army. But they were largely untested in full war, and certainly not in the numbers needed to repel a true orc horde. As governor, it fell to me to marshal every resource and become the wartime leader my title demanded. All my life of scheming in silken halls suddenly seemed almost trivial. Now it was steel and blood that would decide our fate. I convened an emergency war council. The hive aristocracy and military chiefs assembled in my stratageum, a map room usually used for planning parade routes, now hastily converted to command center. A hololithic table projected our system. Red blips marked the orc ships spreading like a stain toward our orbit. Around that table stood generals, PDF colonels, our lone Imperial Navy liaison, even the Mechanicus Magos from the Forges, his logic engine brain calculating deployment metrics as we spoke. Grim determination and barely masked panic warred on many faces. We planned as best we could. No Space Marine chapter or Imperial Navy fleet was close enough to help. All we had was ourselves. I ordered a planet-wide draft. Every able-bodied soul in the underhive and mid-hive would be given a las gun and drilled to fight. It would swell our PDF by millions, though poorly trained millions. They would be meat for the grinder, frankly, but if we were to survive, we needed bodies to slow the green tide. I gave the order nonetheless. I also commanded the void shield generators around each hive to be overcharged, even at risk of burnout, and all orbital defense platforms primed. Our few system defense craft, a handful of monitor frigates and armed merchantmen, were repositioned to harry the orc fleet on approach. The Mechanicus adepts and engineers toiled day and night to fortify hive walls, activate long mothballed macro cannons, rig whole districts with demolition charges. The Magos even deployed a small cohort of his own Skitarii soldiery and a dozen clanking combat servitors to bolster our defenses at critical choke points, a rare and welcome contribution from the priesthood of Mars, and a demonstration that in crisis our secular and tech priest domains could unite their efforts. I spent those frantic days personally coordinating overlapping fields of Thor on maps, signing orders for conscription and rationing, rallying factory masters to churn out weapons at double pace. From the spire, I watched endless lines of hab workers being mustered and armed. I watched children as young as 12 carrying ammunition to gun emplacements on the hive wall. This was it, the moment of truth I'd always feared might come. When the Orc armada finally arrived in orbit, it announced itself with a sky of falling stars and fire. They didn't even attempt negotiation or demands. Orcs rarely do. They just began dropping rocks, hollowed asteroids they use as assault craft, and pouring on the firepower. Our solitary orbital defense platform, his divine Aegis, managed to lance a few of their ships into scrap, and our ground-to-space lasers speared several more. But the Orcs were far too many. Soon, return fire rained down. The void shields above Hive Eterna flared under the impact of burning debris and explosive ordnance. The initial bombardment lasted hours. I spent that night in the primary command bunker under the palace, surrounded by Vox officers relaying frantic messages from our orbital station and Hive defenses. I remember the thrum in my chest each time a distant explosion made the Hive tremble. Hundreds of impacts, like an unholy drum roll of war. One particularly massive detonation rocked the Hive. An Orc rock had kamikazed straight into our main spaceport, obliterating it in a single catastrophic blast. There went our best hope of evacuation or aerial reinforcement. Not that I had intended to flee. To abandon one's world as its lord is heresy in itself. But knowing that route was cut steeled my resolve. There was no escape. We'd fight or we'd die. Then the Greenskins landed. They came screaming through the lower atmosphere on smoke-belching landing craft. Some were shot down by our defense lasers, bright blooms of flame among the clouds. But many smashed into the ground beyond the Hive, disgorging their hordes onto our ash plains. Through magnoculars and servo-skull pictcams, I saw them. An endless surge of hulking, muscular aliens with crude firearms and rusted cleavers, bellowing war cries as they charged. Our forward regiments, brave PDF soldiers dug into trench lines around the Hive perimeter, met them with disciplined volleys. I had personally unsealed ancient weapon vaults to equip our troops with heavy bolters, autocannons, even a few hoary Lehman Russ tanks dragged out of mothballs. Those defenses roared to life, cutting swaths in the green tide. Explosions tore into Orc mobs. Heavy stubber fire mowed down the smaller Gretchen creatures by the dozen. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself hope that discipline and firepower would carry the day. But Orcs seldom falter from casualties that would break a human force. For every score we cut down, more clambered over the bodies. They came on and on, crude war machines lumbering among them, jury-rigged battle wagons belching smoke, clanking walkers bristling with guns. The first of those hit our trench lines within hours. The fight devolved into brutal close combat. Vox reports came in fragmented bursts, static-laced shouts of, "They're overrunning us! Hold the line! Grenades!" Followed by screams and silence. Some companies fought to the last man. Others broke and fell back to secondary positions at the Hive gates. By the second day of the invasion, the Orcs had encircled Hive Eterna and were battering the massive outer gates. I watched from an upper spire with high-powered pict scopes as the main gate, 50 meters tall, solid adamantium, shuddered under repeated blasts from a gargantuan Orc cannon dragged within range. It held for a time. Inside the Hive walls, I had prepared layered defenses, choke points, kill boxes, automated sentry turrets at key intersections. In the maintenance tunnels, we stationed special teams with orders to flood sections with toxic gas or promethium fire if breached. This hive was my fortress, and I intended the Greenskins to pay dearly for every meter of it. They finally cracked through at Gate Sigma just before dusk on the second day. A behemoth Orc, taller than a dreadnought, clad in clanging scrap armor, wielding a starship piston as a battering ram, smashed through the weakened gate after the cannon had blown it half open. A triumphant cheer, picked up on our Vox audio, echoed from the greenskin horde as they poured in through the wrecked gate. My forces initiated Contingency Plan S-16, fall back to pre-designated strongpoints deeper in the hive, heavy bolter nests on high balconies, rockcrete barricades in the main streets, to funnel the invaders down certain avenues where we established overlapping fields of sear from above. That turned the initial breach zone into a charnel house. Hundreds of orcs fell as our entrenched heavy guns raked them from hab block windows and rooftops. I even committed a rare asset: 3 ancient Imperial Knights, small one-man walkers akin to mini-titans, that our house had kept in storage as heirlooms. These knight suits, piloted by noble cousins sworn to me, strode out like mythic giants and engaged the largest orc walkers in titanic melee. I watched through grainy pict feeds as one knight impaled an orc death-dread war machine on its thunder lance, even as another knight was toppled and swarmed by greenskins, clambering over it like ants on a dying animal. For a moment, we seemed to stem the tide. I was on Vox with frontline commanders constantly, my voice relayed to officers across the hive defenses. I exhorted them to hold, to remember their duty, to think of their families behind them. It was stirring stuff, though I suspect fear of the commissars in their midst drove them as much as loyalty to me. Still, they fought bravely, and the orc advance slowed amid the rubble-choked streets. But orcs, damn them, thrive on pitched battle and attrition. For each wave we cut down, another pressed in, climbing mounds of their own dead. My fighters were growing fatigued. Ammo reserves began running low in some sectors. An orc weird boy, a psyker, unleashed a green warp blast that obliterated an entire hab block where one of our heavy weapon squads was positioned. A flank of our defense collapsed there, and greenskins flooded through, slaughtering a company of our troops in brutal hand-to-hand combat. I had to make a critical call: commit my last reserves to plug the gap, or pull everyone back deeper into the hive and cede the mid-levels. I chose to commit the reserves. This included my personal house guard and the palace household troops, who had been held in reserve to secure vital infrastructure, and frankly, to guard me. These elite troops, clad in midnight blue carapace armor embossed with our golden crest, charged forth, singing a battle hymn. They stabilized the faltering flank for a crucial hour, though at great cost. My captain of the guard, a veteran who had protected our family for decades, died holding a stairwell against a rampaging orc knob. They found his body atop a pile of orc berserkers he'd slain, his power sword still buried in the knob's skull. Despite our fierce defense, by the 3rd day, the orcs had pushed kilometers into the lower hive. Entire districts were war zones. The atmosphere was hellish. Fires raged unchecked, turning corridors into smoke-choked furnaces. Civilians who hadn't evacuated in time were screaming, cowering in collapsed habs or crushed underfoot. I ordered any units I could spare to shepherd pockets of civilians out of combat zones, but realistically there was little we could do for them beyond securing the main refugee shelters. Survival of the hive took precedence over individual lives. Some upper hive citizens panicked despite the distance. There were runs on private shuttlecraft, useless since the spaceport was gone, and a few tried to bribe me for off-world escape. I flatly refused. No ships were available, and I needed every transport for resupply and medevac. Others barricaded their mansions and armed their private militias, ready to make a last stand in their gilded halls if the orcs broke through. The Adeptus Arbites, for their part, enforced strict curfews and martial law in the hive to prevent unrest behind our lines, quashing a few instances of looting or rioting swiftly. Thus, at least internal order held even as the enemy pressed in. In those dark hours, a stray thought crossed my mind. Could I lose everything here? All my wealth, my power, meaningless if the orcs stormed the spire and butchered me? Would they squat on my throne, gorging on my exotic fruit and laughing at my finery? The thought of filthy Xenos pawing through my palace filled me with fury, and a desperate resolve that I'd rather see the hive burn, with them in it, than let that happen. And that thought, ironically, gave birth to a solution. Desperation opens doors to drastic choices. I convened the Mechanicus Magos and the senior Arbites Marshal in a sealed strategium meeting. We concocted a risky plan: lure the bulk of the orc horde into a particular mid-hive sector, one with the oldest, most unstable infrastructure, then trigger a controlled collapse of that entire sector. Essentially use a section of our own city as a giant trap, detonate charges on support columns, overload ancient plasma reactors, bring down several square kilometers of hive structure onto the invaders, bury them under millions of tons of rubble. Of course, this would also bury many of our own people and troops caught in that zone. Tens of thousands of civilians remained, and hundreds of my soldiers were still fighting there. But the calculus of war had turned brutal. If we didn't stop the greenskins there, they would reach the upper hive, and then it was the end for everyone. I gave the order. It was one of those unholy decisions you imagine in nightmares, but pray you never have to make in reality. Choosing to sacrifice a chunk of your own city and people in hopes of saving the whole. But war strips away the luxury of moral purity. So our forces executed a fighting withdrawal, deliberately taunting and drawing the orcs after them into Sector 16G, a district dense with promethium storage tanks, massive support pillars, and disused infrastructure. I had Vox operators hurling every insult and provocation at the greenskins, anything to keep them hot on our heels. Orcs obligingly rarely refuse a chase or challenge. The trap was sprung at high noon on the fourth day. I'll never forget the moment. I was in the secondary command post by then. The primary one under the palace had taken a direct hit and been reduced to molten slag. Every picked feed and sensor we had was focused on 16G's central transit junction, once a bustling market square, now a battleground littered with wreckage and orc graffiti. It was packed with greenskins, a seething mass of brutes chasing our last retreating chimera transports. In their midst towered the orc war boss himself, a giant slab of muscle encased in clanking mega armor, roaring orders and brandishing a crackling power claw. He had climbed atop the toppled statue of my great-grandfather, which once stood in that square, like a conquering barbarian king. Around him swarmed hundreds upon hundreds of his boys. I murmured a final prayer to the Emperor for forgiveness and to any souls I was about to entomb. Then I pressed the master detonator rune. For a split second, nothing. Then, hell broke loose. Charges we'd planted on dozens of load-bearing columns across the sector detonated in a carefully timed sequence. The ground beneath the orc horde ruptured as fire gushed from below, swallowing whole swaths of them. Above, far overhead, plasma reactor cores that powered the transit rails went critical, blossoming into miniature suns. I glimpsed one on a piked feed blazing white-hot before the feed went dead. A split second later, the supports gave way. In a chain of thunderous booms that I felt even in my command post miles away, entire gigantic hab blocks and transit causeways collapsed onto the invaders. Great slabs of rockcrete and plasteel, each the size of a hab tower, came crashing down. The piked feeds went to static one by one as the very hive city itself caved in on Sector 16G. The rumbling didn't stop for a good minute. When it finally did and the dust began to settle, Sector 16G simply wasn't there anymore. What had been a labyrinth of streets and towers was now an immense smoking crater, like a giant had scooped a bite out of the hive. Parts of lower levels hung exposed around the edges, smoldering. The Orc war boss and thousands of his warriors were entombed under that avalanche of destruction, along with many valiant Imperial defenders and unfortunate civilians. We had decapitated the invasion by literally decapitating a part of our city. The gamble worked. With their war boss and so many of their number obliterated in one blow, the remaining orcs were thrown into disarray. Many still fought on stubbornly wherever they were, but we now had the advantage. Our forces rallied and pushed, retaking streets inch by inch. Sniper teams moved onto vantage points and began picking off leaderless orcs. Stubborn pockets of greenskins had to be flushed out with flamers or nerve gas grenades in tunnels. But by day 6, the last significant knot of resistance, a mob cornered in the sub-hive sewers, was exterminated after we flooded the tunnels with toxic gas. Maltheria Prime had survived. Barely. The cost was staggering. Over 30 million of our people dead by post-battle estimates. Large portions of Hive Eterna lay in ruins between the Orc devastation and our own extreme measures. Our manufactorum output was halved until major repairs could be made. The spaceport was gone completely. Piles of Orc corpses, and tragically human ones, towered in the streets, requiring servitor crews months to incinerate or bury. The air stank of ash, promethium, and death. I toured some of the battle-ravaged zones in the aftermath, escorted by my guards. It was the first time in many years I'd set foot in the mid-hive in person, rather than through a secure transit capsule. I walked through shattered avenues I dimly remembered visiting long ago in pomp, now turned to smoking rubble. Crowds of surviving citizens looked at me as I passed, some with awe and gratitude, as the savior who delivered victory, others with sullen hatred for the collateral carnage I'd unleashed. They mostly kept their eyes down, but I could feel both emotions in equal measure. I couldn't blame them for either. I made sure publicly to thank the populace for their sacrifice and courage, framing the entire ordeal as a testament to imperial devotion. At a mass funeral pyre where thousands of our dead were being cremated, the smoke a black pillar climbing to the clouds, I delivered a eulogy that moved many to tears. I even managed to summon a tear myself for the Peist recorders. By thinking of my fallen guard captain and, yes, by thinking of the weight of innocent lives I'd snuffed out, collapsing that sector. It was not entirely feigned emotion. They say war is the great auditor of the soul. It presents you a bill and demands payment in blood or conscience. The Orc War presented me such a bill, and I paid it, mostly in others' blood, yes, but also with a piece of my own humanity, perhaps. After the invasion, something changed in me. I had seen the precipice of losing everything. I had witnessed horrors those days, comrades torn apart, my hive city desecrated, children crying over parents' corpses in the ruins. You don't go through that unscarred inside. I became both more hardened and, oddly, more aware of what truly matters. On one hand, I had prevailed, and that victory bolstered my authority immensely. No one on Maltheria Prime dared question my rule now. I had led us through an existential threat and emerged triumphant. If any noble had harbored thoughts of challenging me, they evaporated after seeing me willing to do anything, even destroy part of my own capital, to win. Fear and respect for Lord Rorim reached an all-time high. The Administratum, on hearing of our stand, sent a perfunctory commendation scroll, along with a notice increasing our tithe obligations to recover lost munitions stockpiles. Typical. The Ecclesiarchy held a grand Te Deum Mass, praising the Emperor's guidance, manifest through our courageous governor. They even painted me as a sort of holy warrior in one fresco at the rebuilt gate. A flattering and exaggerated depiction, of course, but useful for morale. On the other hand, I couldn't shake a certain hollowness in the months after. The opulence of my life felt strangely trivial for a time. I would sit in my lavish bedchamber at night, the same silken drapes and carved furniture around me. But I'd recall that field hospital massacre, or the moment I consigned 1,000 innocent people to death under falling rubble, and I'd feel tired, as if a piece of me was buried in that crater with the orcs. Of course, outwardly I showed none of this. A planetary governor cannot afford visible doubt or remorse. Rebuilding demanded my full attention. Repairing hive infrastructure, restarting industries, caring for orphaned noble scions of fallen officers, with appropriate letters of condolence and assurances, their houses would not lose imperial favor due to their patriarch's heroic deaths. The Adeptus Mechanicus was hounding me to salvage as much orc scrap as possible. They covet xenotech for study. I gave them license to comb the battlefields, which they did with gusto, carting off twisted metal and orc weapons to dissect in their foundries. I also made sure to collect a few personal trophies from the war. A habit of mine, a tangible reminder of what real war is like, and why I should avoid it whenever possible. One trophy is the orc war boss's iron lower jaw, recovered in the rubble of Sector 16G. They presented it to me, and I had it mounted on a plaque in my study with an inscription, "Thus to the enemies of mankind." Another trophy is less physical, a renewed appreciation for the soldiers and people who actually bleed to uphold this Imperium. It's almost comical. It took waves of bloodthirsty aliens for me to feel a kinship, however slight, with the common soldiery. After the war, I quietly ordered improved rations and an extra rest day for the surviving PDF regiments, a small gesture of gratitude. I doubt it made a huge difference in the long run, but it felt right. Normally, I view the masses cynically as tools, but those individuals saved my life as surely as I saved theirs. There is a bond in shared struggle that can momentarily bridge even our vast class divide. However, the grim reality remains. Had the war gone differently, I wouldn't be here to tell this tale. No amount of gold or privilege shielded me. It was steel and sacrifice that preserved us. In the aftermath, as I oversaw reconstruction from my spire, often literally looking down at swarms of workers, clearing rubble like ants, I was struck by the transience of it all. We erect these towering edifices of power, but brute, ignorant forces can bring them down in the blink of an eye. It made me both fearful and determined, fearful that one day something might come that even our cunning and might cannot stop. A tyrannid hive fleet, an incurable plague, an unchecked demonic incursion, and determined that if that day ever comes, I will face it as unyieldingly as I did the orcs, until my last breath, because that is what duty demands. Little did I realize that the next great test wouldn't come from the stars, but from within. Even as we mended our walls and buried our dead heroes, a rot was spreading in the shadows of our victory, a rot of the soul, born from the very decadence and despair the war had heightened. And it would bring another confrontation, one unlike any orc battle, a confrontation with the darkness lurking within my own court, and the baleful gaze of the Emperor's most feared agents turned upon me. It started subtly. Whispers among the palace staff that one of the high-born ladies had taken a peculiar interest in certain forbidden books. The sudden suicide of an underhive cleric who left a scrawled note rambling about the Prince of Pleasure coming to claim dues. A spate of odd behaviors among a clique of young nobles, They stopped attending cathedral masses and instead held private gatherings at an abandoned manor on the hive's edge. On the surface, these might be dismissed as gossip and eccentricity, but taken together, they pricked the instincts of one person in particular, Sister Callia of the Order Famulus. The Order Famulus, for context, consists of Adepta Sororitas, sisters, who attach to noble households to advise on genealogy, piety, and to keep watch for spiritual deviants. Sister Callia had been a fixture in my court for years, a prim, ever-smiling woman in a plain black habit, more a background figure arranging marriages and chaperoning young ladies than someone I paid heed to. We nobles half ignored her, thinking her a harmless busybody. But it appears she was sharper than we thought. One evening, Sister Callia requested a private audience. I met her in a quiet antechamber by the chapel. She was visibly agitated, more than I'd ever seen this usually composed sister. Her hands trembled on her rosary as she murmured, "My Lord Governor, forgive my boldness, but I fear a great evil has taken root near you." That got my attention. She proceeded in low, urgent tones to share her suspicions. She believed a chaos cult, specifically Slanesh, the Prince of Excess, was operating among some of the nobles of my court. At the name of that chaos god, a chill ran through me. Even a worldly cynic like me knows the ruinous powers are no trivial matter. We invoke the god emperor's protection against them at every mass. The thought that some in my circle might be dabbling with such corruption, it made my blood run cold. I pressed her for evidence. Sister Callia produced a small diary bound in pinkish leather. Disturbingly, I realized, leather of human origin. It had belonged to a lady's maid in House Marnek's service, the house of Lady Salantia, my friend. This maid had died under strange circumstances, officially an illness, but the sister suspected otherwise. The diary detailed how the maid's mistress, Salantia's only daughter, Lady Aurelia Marnek, had been hosting secret midnight gatherings. They started as indulgent parties, but had progressed to something darker. The maid described masked revels with bizarre music and narcotic vapors, and participants whispering oaths to someone called the Prince of Pleasure and She Who Thirsts, both epithets of the chaos god Slanesh. She wrote of seeing orgiastic rites that disturbed her and hinted at violent or sacrificial acts taking place in locked rooms. The final entry cut off in mid-sentence, the last intelligible line being, "I fear what will become of me. Lady Aurelia says I must prove myself tonight or—" and then it trailed off. The maid turned up dead the next day. As I read those passages, anger and revulsion warred within me. If true, this wasn't mere youthful debauchery. It was capital H heresy, blooming right under my nose. That Lady Salantia's own daughter could be leading it. It felt like a personal slap as well as a dire threat to the entire planet's spiritual safety. Sister Callia urged me to act, but also to be discreet. We'd likely need the ecclesiarchy, perhaps even the Inquisition. At mention of the Inquisition, my alarm grew. The Holy Ordos do not take such matters lightly, and their solutions can be extreme. The last thing I wanted was an inquisitor arriving and declaring an exterminatus, or mass purgation of my court. The collateral damage, to put it mildly, would be immense, to my planet and to my position. Yet I could not ignore this. If a chaos cult was truly growing amongst my nobles, it could lead to demon summonings, a hive revolt, or worse. And then the Inquisition would come anyway, with fire and wrath indiscriminately. So I thanked Sister Callia for her courage and discretion. I told her I would handle it from here, and that we must keep this absolutely secret, while I decide a course. She looked relieved to have passed the burden on, but she cautioned, "Do not underestimate the enemy, my lord. Sin wears many masks among the highborn." I intended to investigate quietly via my own agents. However, events overtook me. Barely 2 days later, an Inquisitor arrived on Maltheria Prime. Whether due to Sister Callia's messages to her superiors or the Imperium's own intelligence, the Ordo Hereticus had taken interest. He came unannounced, as Inquisitors do, appearing one morning at my palace gate with a retinue of black-armored stormtroopers, a silent, blank-eyed psyker, and a stern interrogator at his side. His name was Inquisitor Hale. Middle-aged, plain-looking, wearing a simple storm coat over carapace armor. He could have been mistaken for an Arbites detective, were it not for the unmistakable rosette he carried and the authority in his demeanor. I received him in the grand hall, all polite smiles and deep bows, as if welcoming an honored guest. Inside, I was churning with anxiety. Inquisitors hold the power of life and death over worlds. One misstep from me here, and I could be executed as a traitor, or my world put to the torch. After introductions, he refused refreshment or pleasantries. Inquisitor Hale was blunt. "Your world harbors heresy, Governor. I trust you are aware of the matters to which I refer." I glanced at Sister Callia, who stood behind me, and Hale's eyebrow arched as if to say, "Of course she told us." There was little point dissembling. I admitted that disturbing allegations had indeed come to light, and that I stood ready to cooperate fully with his investigation to purge any stain of chaos from our midst. I carefully framed myself as an ally in this, not a suspect. He held my gaze a long moment. Perhaps his psyker quietly brushed my mind. I felt a tingle in my skull. Whatever he sensed, Hale gave a curt nod. "Good. We will begin at once." And just like that, the inquisition of my inner circle began. Hale wasted no time. He effectively took over a wing of my palace as his base of operations. One by one, members of my court were summoned for questioning. Noble lords and ladies, some of the same people who had toasted my health a week prior, now found themselves sitting in bare chambers under the unflinching stare of inquisitorial interrogators. Stormtroopers stood guard at every exit. My cooperation was, of course, highly visible. I assigned a squad of my own elite guards to assist Hale's forces in securing areas and detaining suspects. I personally sat in on many of the interviews, with Hale's consent, to demonstrate I had nothing to hide and to subtly ensure the Inquisitor did not overstep. Though, what could I really do if he did? Still, presence is influence. What came out was like lancing a boil and seeing the pus flood forth. Ugly, but necessary. Under relentless questioning, and in some cases under truth serums or psychic compulsion, a sordid picture emerged. Several young nobles were indeed deeply involved. Names were named. The more we learned, the more certain it became that Lady Aurelia Marnek, the daughter of my friend Lady Salantia, was at the center of the cult. And she was not alone. A few of her close companions, dissolute heirs from other houses, were implicated as her co-conspirators. One or two of the lesser nobles cracked quickly and confessed. They described illicit gatherings in a secret pleasure manner on the hive's edge. What started as thrill-seeking clubs of bored nobles experimenting with obscura and bizarre entertainments had, under Aurelia's influence, and a mysterious figure she called the Voice, evolved into full-blown blasphemous rites. They spoke of masked orgies bathed in hallucinogenic fumes, of shrines hidden behind false walls adorned with profane symbols, of innocents lured or kidnapped from the underhive to be used as playthings or sacrifices. One tearful noble boy confessed that at the climax of one gathering, a drugged underhive girl had her throat slit on an altar, while participants smeared her blood on their lips and chanted to Slanesh for sensation beyond mortal limits. I fought to keep my face impassive hearing this. Inside, rage and disgust contended with an icy fear. It was far worse than I had imagined. All trails pointed to a singular locus, that old estate on the upper mid-hive outskirts, which had belonged to a extinct minor house. Now I realized why it had been left unallocated in administratum records. The cult had intentionally kept it low profile. That was their temple of sin. Inquisitor Hale did not hesitate. On the third night of the investigation, he declared we would raid the site and purge the heresy at its source. He did not ask my permission, but curtly accepted my offer of assistance. I insisted on accompanying him. I suspect he was of two minds about that, but ultimately allowed it, likely calculating that I might be useful, or at least that seeing the horror firsthand would bind me fully to the Inquisition's cause. He was correct on the latter point. So it was that I found myself just past midnight, descending into the depths of that forgotten Marnek estate with a fire team of black-armored inquisitorial stormtroopers at my back. I wore carapace armor under a dark cloak and carried a hell pistol and my power sword. My heart pounded not just from the physical exertion of prying open rusted bulkhead doors, but from anticipation and dread. Hale moved ahead of me, bolt pistol drawn, reciting a quiet prayer of cleansing. The air was heavy with cloying incense seeping from below. We breached a final set of oaken doors, carved with strange, leering faces. Behind them was a scene out of nightmare. The manor's grand ballroom had been transformed into a profane temple. Scores of figures, some masked, some half-naked, all in various stages of frenzied ecstasy, whirled and writhed to a weird, pulsating music that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Braziers exuded narcotic smoke that swirled in multicolored clouds. The center of the room was dominated by an altar draped in silks and spattered with blood. Atop it lay the lifeless body of a young man, one of my missing clerks I recognized with a jolt, his chest ritually cut open. Two cultists were collecting his blood in golden chalices while chanting. Presiding over it all on the dais was a tall, unnaturally graceful figure in a golden mask fashioned into a demonic visage. This, I knew at once, was the one called the Voice. He, or perhaps she, the form was androgynous even under the elaborate purple robes, raised a hand to still the music as our incursion shattered whatever trance the congregation was in. For an instant, the masked leader and I locked eyes across the hall. Though his were hidden behind that grinning mask, I felt a palpable malice and amusement emanate. Around him, the cultists paused in their revels, a few screaming as they realized armed intruders were upon them. Then all hell broke loose. A knot of devoted cultists, rather than flee or surrender, charged at us with wild howls. Some wielding ornate daggers, others with hands grown into clawed mutations. Hale's stormtroopers opened fire in disciplined volleys, cutting the first wave down in seconds. Last bolts and shotgun blasts tore through silk-clad nobles, splattering decadent tapestries with very mortal blood. Some cultists shrieked and scrambled for cover behind pillars or under tables. Others, perhaps too deep in a drug-fueled haze, kept on dancing mindlessly, even as laser fire stitched across the walls. I saw Lady Aurelia Marnek herself near the dais, clad in a diaphanous gown, her face painted in garish cosmetics, a look of shock and fury contorting her pretty features. She screamed something, a curse at us, or a prayer to her foul prince, and clutched at the masked voice. The golden-masked leader seemed unperturbed. He, I'll use he for convenience, made a sweeping gesture with a rod-like staff in his hand, and suddenly a wave of cloying purple mist billowed forth. I recognized the shimmer of warp energy. Hale shouted, "Witchcraft!" and raised a suppression sigil. The mist washed over our forefront troopers and I, and an overwhelming wave of euphoria and temptation assaulted my mind. It was as if a chorus of honeyed voices whispered every forbidden desire I'd ever entertained, offering them freely. I felt my resolve waver, my grip on my pistols slacken as an almost irresistible bliss beckoned me to just stop fighting and drown in sensation. But one advantage of a lifetime of cynicism and mental guard, I recoiled from the false ecstasy instinctively. That and the inquisitorial psyker behind me immediately projected a damping field that blunted the witchcraft. I shook my head clear in time to see one of our troopers, less fortunate, drop his weapon and start giggling mindlessly before an enraged noblewoman, her refined mask long lost, revealing an inhumanly distorted, ecstatic face, stabbed him in the neck. I shot her before she could lick the blood off her blade. "In the name of the God Emperor," Inquisitor Hale's voice boomed, augmented by Vox, "you are found wanting. Surrender or be purged." His stormtroopers spread out in practiced sweeps, covering the hall. Some panicked cultists indeed threw down their weapons and prostrated themselves, wailing for mercy. The weak-willed, perhaps only dabblers who never expected things to go this far. Others answered with loss and autogun fire. Yes, a few had firearms stashed and began a desperate shootout from behind pillars. I took cover behind a fallen marble statue as red last shots scorched past my cheek. My guards returned fire with precision. Suddenly, a blood-curdling shriek split the air. Not human. I risked a glance and saw one of the cultists convulsing on the floor, his body twisting and bulging. With horror, I realized the voice had thrown some object onto the ground that shattered, perhaps a warp-tainted vial, and whatever vile sorcery it contained was mutating those around it. 2, 3 cultists nearby howled as their limbs elongated obscenely, or chitinous exoskeletons erupted from their flesh. In seconds, new gibbering fiends rose, where once devotees had stood. A woman's head blossomed into a tentacled mass of feelers. A man's skin metallicized into a reflective, faceless chrome, and his arms sprouted scythe-like blades. They turned on us with feral speed. One leapt at a stormtrooper and cleaved him nearly in half before multiple hellgun bursts blew the mutant apart. Another barreled toward Inquisitor Hale, shrieking with multiple mouths. Hale stood his ground and emptied his bolt pistol into it at close range. The thing's head exploded in a shower of ichor, splattering across Aurelia Marnek, who cowered nearby, half sane with terror now that reality crashed back in. Within minutes, most of the cult lay dead or dying. The hall was hazy with smoke and ozone. The golden-masked voice and a handful of inner-circle cultists had pulled back to the dais, surrounded by the bodies of their victims and the perfumed haze of dissipating warp energy. I saw Lady Aurelia kneeling, sobbing and disoriented, at the feet of her masked mentor. He held her by the hair. His other hand pressed a wickedly curved dagger to her throat as we closed in. "Hold your fire," Hale commanded, not wanting to lose a primary conspirator and noble daughter if it could be helped. The Inquisitor stepped forward, flanked by 2 troopers aiming right at the voice. The voice's mask turned toward us. Up close, I could see intricate runework on its surface, and behind the eye slits a faint glow of unnatural blue eyes. When he spoke, his voice was resonant, charming, and dripping with malice. "Inquisitor," he cooed, his high Gothic pronunciation oddly archaic. "How kind of you to join our soiree. I'm afraid the festivities are nearly concluded." "Release the girl and surrender," Hale demanded coldly. "By his authority, I will grant you the Emperor's mercy." Mercy being a quick death versus what surely awaited otherwise. The golden mask threw back in a laugh, an unsettlingly beautiful bell-like laugh that somehow made my skin crawl. "Mercy? How quaint. I offer you mercy, blind servants. Kneel, cast down your weapons, and I may yet allow you to taste pleasures beyond your— Hale wasn't one for villainous monologues. "Take him," he snapped. In an instant, multiple things happened. The voice sliced his dagger across Aurelia's neck, perhaps deciding to spite us by denying our rescue. But by some miracle, or the young woman's own reflex, the blade only scored a shallow cut as Aurelia jerked aside with a cry. In that same heartbeat, a sharp crack rang out. My guard captain, an expert sniper, had a clear shot and took it. A single hot-shot last bolt drilled through the golden mask right between the eye slits. The cult leader staggered, a spray of blood arcing from the back of his head. Then he toppled off the dais, lifeless, mask clattering on the floor. Aurelia fainted. From shock or blood loss, I wasn't sure. Later, it proved to be a superficial wound. The remaining cultists, a few who had been holding the perimeter, seeing their prophet fall, threw down their weapons and either tried to flee or begged for mercy. The fight was over. It was eerily quiet, save for Aurelia's soft sobbing and the crackling of small fires among heaps of silk and flesh. I surveyed the carnage. Dozens upon dozens of nobles and their victims lay scattered, twisted in death. The beautiful marble floor was sticky with mingled blood, wine, and unidentifiable fluids from warp-spawned abominations. The air stank of singed flesh and sickly sweet narcotics. My stomach churned. Inquisitor Hale stepped onto the dais and kicked aside the golden mask, now flecked with its owner's blood. Underneath it, the cult leader's revealed face was shockingly young and handsome, and entirely too perfect, like a statue of an angel, albeit with eyes burned out by lost impact. Some greater demon's touch had likely kept him preternaturally lovely until his abrupt end. "Throne of Terror," I murmured, struggling to process that such utter blasphemy had been growing in my house, perverting those I thought I knew. Hale turned to me, his face grim. "Now you see, Governor, why vigilance must never slacken among even the most privileged. The rot of heresy spares no one." He was right, of course. I nodded, numb. In the following days, the cleanup was as thorough as it was merciless. Hale's team and my own security forces rounded up every individual remotely connected to the cult. Noble scions, servants who had procured drugs or victims, a few Hive City entertainers and chem dealers who had supplied the gatherings, all were arrested. Interrogations were conducted, some under truth drugs, some under more persuasive methods. We left no coven member unaccounted for, as far as we could determine. Judgment was swift and unsentimental. Publicly, I announced that an abhorrent chaos cult had been uncovered and purged, its members to face the Emperor's justice. Many of the captured nobles, especially those who were mere peripheral participants, were executed quietly behind closed doors to avoid public scandal, recorded as died resisting arrest or perished in cleansing. A handful of prime instigators, however, were made examples of. In Hive Eterna's central square, before a massive crowd, a purification pyre was erected. Those deemed most corrupted, including, heartbreakingly, young Lady Aurelia Marnek, were chained to iron stakes and burned alive as heretics. I stood alongside Inquisitor Hale on a balcony, watching with a stony expression as the flames consumed them. Aurelia's screams rang in my ears long after they ceased with a final, terrible wail. Her mother, Lady Salantia, had been spared execution. The investigation showed Salantia was blissfully ignorant of her daughter's heresy, but her punishment was exile to a distant convent to live out her days in penitent prayer. I glimpsed Salantia in the crowd, wailing in anguish as her only child burned. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer for forgiveness that I doubted would be heard. Hale left soon after. Before he departed, we spoke privately in my burnt-out banquet hall. How symbolic. He was surprisingly frank. "Worlds far less tainted have been subjected to exterminatus," he said. "You have the Emperor, or perhaps your quick action, to thank that Maltheria Prime wasn't one of them. We caught this in time. See that you never let such corruption fester again." I bowed and assured him I would redouble my vigilance. He must have sensed my genuine resolve, because he actually placed a hand on my shoulder, a rare gesture, and said, "The war against chaos is never-ending, Governor, but today, at least, you fought on the right side." With that, and after requisitioning a few of the cult's recovered artifacts for study or destruction, he and his retinue left as abruptly as they'd come, on to the next fire of heresy in the galaxy. I took his words to heart. In the aftermath, I quietly instituted a moral crackdown in my court. Nothing overtly tyrannical. I didn't say, ban all revelry. That would be impossible and counterproductive. But I reined in the excess sharply. The wild masquerades and narcotic-fueled orgies disappeared. If any still occurred, they were small, deeply secret, and constantly fearful of my spies. I increased the presence of confessors and ecclesiarchy clergy at gatherings. Now, any grand ball begins with a solemn prayer and ends at a respectable hour with many a noble only mildly drunk instead of lost to debauchery. A few of my high-born peers grumbled, quietly, that court life had become dull. I can live with dull. The fate of House Marnek is an effective cautionary tale. No one wishes to be the next object of an inquisitor's wrath. I essentially forced a veneer of Puritan propriety back onto high society. Publicly, everything is prim and proper now. Of course, behind closed doors, vice still exists. Human nature doesn't change that easily. But overt degeneracy is out. The truly sick appetites are driven deeper underground, where I can hopefully detect and stamp them out before they bloom. I personally have become more devout, or at least more publicly devout, since that close call. I attend cathedral mass more regularly, always in the front pew with head bowed. I speak more often of the Emperor's grace in my addresses. I even allowed a chapter of the Order Famulus to permanently station multiple sisters at my palace, whereas before it was just one aging sister. So now there are watchful eyes in every corner, keeping our household spiritually guided. I figure it's better to have the sororitas as allies in maintaining some moral order than risk them turning those flame gouts on us again. So far, it's working. The court of Maltheria Prime is now regarded in sector gossip as austere and traditionalist. A somewhat amusing reputation, given the reality, is simply that we've dialed our open depravity from a 9 down to maybe a 4. But perception is everything. During that purge, one of the saddest duties I had was speaking with Lady Salantia after her daughter's execution. I visited her in the convent cell where she awaited transport off-world. She was a broken woman, eyes red, spirit seemingly drained. She looked at me with such sorrow. "We were friends once, Septimus," she whispered. "How did it come to this?" I had no answer that could comfort her. I could only pledge that Aurelia's soul would be prayed for, and that I'd ensure House Marnek's name remained respected. A half-lie, their family was ruined. She gave a mirthless little laugh at that. What need have I for reputation? My line ends in ash. I left in silence, resolving that I would never allow such corruption to take root again on my watch. And so, scars within scars, we moved forward. In the time since, Maltheria Prime has remained stable and even prospered. The manufactorums hum, fully repaired and pushing out armaments at record pace. Fear and piety can motivate workers as much as whips and rations. The administratum scribes calculate that our tithe performance has improved 4.6% since I took over, something I take pride in. Partly it's because, after those crises, I run a tighter ship. Lazy or incompetent officials have been replaced, some violently. The new generation of managers and magistrates know what fate awaits failure or corruption under my rule. Indeed, I've become exactly what my father intended me to be, an immovable pillar of authority for this world, perhaps more iron than he ever was, in fact. I sometimes wonder if he would be proud or secretly a bit horrified. Either way, I know he would nod approvingly that I am keeping our domain secure and productive above all else. I've outlived many who opposed or envied me. Rejuvenate treatments, available only to the extremely wealthy and well-connected naturally, course through my veins now, retarding my aging. I appear a man in his prime, though I'm well past middle age. Barring violence or an unlikely natural death, I might rule for centuries. The thought appeals to the vanity in me, even as another part of me wonders what centuries more of this life would do to my soul. What more is there to experience that I haven't already? I have had unimaginable pleasures at my fingertips, and also unimaginable horrors. I've worn the crown of power and the mask of saintliness. I've faced war, conspiracy, betrayal, and worse. Sometimes, in quieter moments, I ask myself, after all this, would I do it the same way again? The answer is always yes. I made my choices with eyes wide open, and I live, and many others died, by those choices. I may carry the burden of monstrous deeds on my conscience, but I carry it so that the Imperium, and my world, continues to exist. Better I live with blood on my hands than abdicate my duty and watch everything burn. Not that I ever seriously considered abdication. I never married. I found the notion of sharing power or being vulnerable through official family ties too hazardous. Instead, I contented myself over the years with courtesans and discreet liaisons, careful never to let personal attachments overrule my judgment. There were a few lovers, I recall, with something akin to fondness, but ultimately power and duty have been my true companions. Some future heir of mine, a distant nephew or niece perhaps, since I have no direct children, will one day gaze at my portrait in the palace gallery and perhaps wonder about me as I gazed at those before me. Will that heir know the truth of what it meant to be me? The burdens, the compromises, the darkness endured? Likely not. History, especially the sanitized chronicles of noble houses, will remember me as some stoic, prosperous ruler who overcame an orc attack and maintained stability. They may omit the fratricide, the purges, the human cost. Perhaps that's for the best. Perhaps that is simply how the Imperium must function, by burying uncomfortable truths and canonizing necessary evils as virtuous deeds in hindsight. Sometimes I think of leaving a private memoir locked away for some far future generation, a full accounting like this very monologue I've given you. Then again, perhaps not. Let the legends stand. They serve the Imperium's needs better than the raw truth. It's strange, really. I have wealth beyond measure, power beyond accountability on my world, and through Juvenat, I even hold a longer lease on life than most. By all accounts, I won the grand game that so few ever even get to play. And yet on certain nights I find myself on that same balcony, looking out over the hive's twinkling lights in the smoggy dark, and feeling the weight of it all. The weight of the lives sacrificed for my victory, the weight of the vigilance I must never relinquish. On those nights, with the distant sounds of the manufactoria echoing up, the clang of metal, the hum of billions working and living, I whisper quietly to the darkness. I recite to myself the price I've paid and the promise I keep. In the grim darkness of the far future, I will not be a victim. I will be the darkness, rich, potent, and unyielding, that stands between my world and the abyss. That is my vow, and thus far I have kept it.